I think we'd all judge that to be a higher importance.
I bet it's spam. Oh, right, we're live. Perfect. Hi, everyone. Welcome to our latest UK and a Changing Europe lunch hour event. And who said we weren't prescient, eh? Just when Reform are all over the news, we have a special lunch hour for you looking at Reform UK, considering their place in our political system. I'm sure by the end, we'll get to discussing some of the recent happenings as well. Got a fantastic panel. Paula Surridge, UK and a Changing Europe and University of Bristol, Rob Ford, University of Manchester, UK and a Changing Europe, and our very own Sophie Stowers. Welcome, all of you. I want to start, and as ever, stick your questions on the Slido and vote for the ones you want me to pose to the panel, and I'll try and do that better than I normally do and not leave hundreds of them unanswered. But I want to start by going back to the general election and just reflecting on what happened then. Would do you think Reform UK would have been pleased with how they'd performed? Any of you? Oh, actually, my other half said I should name people for this, otherwise there are always pregnant pauses. So I'm going to say Paula.
Okay, I'll take that one because I think the answer to that question is the same as the answer to so many questions about that general election, in that it depends whether you ask them in terms of seats or in terms of share of the vote. I suspect they'll be very pleased with the result in terms of seats because that was quite unexpected. But the share of the vote wasn't that much higher than UKIP got in 2015, with more candidates, more publicity, more favourable conditions with the Conservative vote collapsing. So I think publicly they would certainly tell you they were pleased with the result, but I think possibly we're expecting vote share to be a little bit higher, perhaps even with fewer seats.
Rob, would you go along with that?
Yeah, I would. I do think if you look at the map as well of reform support in 2024, it overlaps a lot with the map of UKIP in 2015, and in some respects, I think that will be a disappointment for them because they needed to sort of expand their coalition from where they were back then. I think two relatively bright spots from then that may be relevant for our politics going forward, though, were that they did do rather well in Wales and they did do much better than UKIP ever did in Scotland. Both of those countries have devolved elections under a rather different electoral system, and both of those countries also, quite significantly, already have a five-party system. So you end up with some very fragmented politics and the potential for reform to get seats on an even lower threshold of the vote. And of course, in both of those countries, there's a kind of deep-rooted historical antipathy to the Conservative Party, who are seen as something of an English party. Now, UKIP was seen in the same terms, particularly in Scotland, but maybe if Reform can position themselves as a party of the socially conservative right that isn't associated with Westminster in England, they could potentially displace the Conservatives in these places. So that was a bright spot, I think.
Okay, it's very interesting already that both of you have sort of drawn a straight line from 2015 to 2024. And of course, stuff happened in between. And it's just the way you both did that, I thought was really, really interesting, because when I looked at 2024, the first thought was, oh, we're back. It's as if the intervening years hadn't happened. But it wasn't quite as easy as building on 2015, was it? Because they had to, they'd done mission accomplished, hadn't they, in a way, with 2016. So they had to totally reinvent themselves, didn't they, in some ways?
For sure, but they'd already done some of that reinvention in 2019, of course, the 2019 kind of madness moment when the polls went mad and, Labour and Conservatives were in third and fourth. And so there's some of that rebranding had happened at that point. But when I think about the 2024 election, the election I think it's closest to, and the one that I use most as a kind of mental reference point, is 2015, because it was that fragmented landscape. So yeah, it is a kind of denial of the 2017 and 2019 elections in some ways.
I think also remembering that we had the two elections and the referendum in between, returning to Paula's first point, makes Reform's performance look worse in terms of the yardstick we should be judging them on should be higher. The EU referendum and its aftermath significantly boosted Farage's profile. He's probably the second best known politician in the country now. And it generated a new kind of gravitational force in British politics in terms of Brexit partisanship, which should have been of a valuable resource for a Farage type party, present itself as the true party of Leave, the true party of Brexit. I mean, they literally were the Brexit party for a while. So both of those should have been forces that had the potential to expand the sort of reform appeal. But in the end, it didn't expand a great deal.
And Sophie, I know you said you wanted to go last, so you can go last. Just thinking back to the election, do you share the thoughts of Rob and Paula about that actually in terms of vote share there might have been a bit of disappointment?
So I think you can see that in the approach that the leadership of the party has taken since the election, in that they obviously see value in trying to broaden their appeal and sort of moderate slightly, because that's really the only way they're going to be able to expand that vote share enough to actually translate it into more parliamentary seats and parliamentary influence. I think they maybe feel that by kind of replicating the vote share that UKIP got in 2015, they've maybe topped out that, the vote share they're going to get from that section of the electorate on that kind of appeal, and they maybe need to go a bit more mainstream if they're going to be any more kind of influential, both in Parliament and in terms of vote share overall.
And what do you mean when you say more mainstream? Presumably not more liberal on immigration.
I don't mean that. I mean, I think I guess is sort of like professionalization, if I can even say that word, a little bit more, making the party look a bit less amateurish in terms of its structures, having a proper membership system and so on. But I think also broadening the platform of the party from not just being almost kind of a single issue, anti-immigration party, but starting to broaden out that appeal to look at kind of a broader economic platform. What are your perspectives on things like net zero, like housing, welfare, all those kinds of things, which I think for Reform previously and its predecessor parties, you've kind of had maybe an idea of what its politics are or its party platform is on those areas, but they've never really, that's not really necessarily been the campaigning kind of messaging or platform that they've been going to the public with. It's usually been around that one issue of migration or the relationship with Europe. And so I think kind of broadening out that appeal a bit more so you can catch voters who might be more broadly discontented with the mainstream parties and mainstream politics, but immigration might not necessarily be the driving factor as to where their vote is going at a general election.
All right, we'll come back to all those issues. I want to talk a bit about net zero and a bit about immigration, but just on party organisation. I mean, Rob, you literally wrote the book on UKIP, looking at UKIP and looking at reform. Are they similar sorts of organisation?
No, they aren't. And I think that the differences reflect the lessons that Nigel Farage learned about party organisation, both in his time in UKIP and from talking to various figures across the populist radical right in Europe. So UKIP was a kind of traditional member-based party. Members had a role. There was an internal governance structure, and it wasn't just the one-man band. Farage had to persuade people to go along with what he wanted to do, and he found that tremendously frustrating because UKIP was extremely prone to splits and arguments. So when he set up the Brexit Party, as was, it was very much Nigel Farage PLC. It literally was, I believe, some sort of a corporation with Farage as the majority shareholder. Now, he's made some noises about making Reform a more traditional party, but he's doing it very much on his terms. So he still has, I think, the controlling interest and the decisive vote. So if people have different views to Nigel on what Reform should do, they are welcome to feed those in. And if Nigel happens to agree, then maybe they'll happen. But if Nigel doesn't, then they don't. And that's a model he's very much adopted. I think explicitly he's talked about this, that it came from the Geert Wilders party in the Netherlands, which I think has two members, Geert Wilders. I forget who the other one is. Maybe it's Geert Wilders' hamster or something like that. And that was the model, and it was the same reasoning. Wilders had the same sort of issues. With these kinds of parties, installing discipline is a perennial problem, which I'm sure we'll come on to in terms of current events. And so from the outset, he wanted a structure that made it very easy for him to do that. It is, in that respect, very much a one-man band. But then when you look at him as a resource and his profile, it's kind of justifiably a one-man band, because it very much is Nigel and the Seven Dwarves, or Nigel and the Four Dwarves, or whatever it might be. And no one has anywhere near his reach and profile. So it's actually got a logic to it that he be the one that decide how things go with reform.
We will come on to current events, but firstly, I want to ask you all a nightmare question, given what Rob just said, and let's see who wants to volunteer for this. Would they have done far worse had Nigel Farage not come back?
Yes.
Okay.
Not a nightmare question.
That's absolutely clear.
I'd say
I mean,
not
how
far
much
worse.
worse? Yes,
Sorry. I thought you finished with your one word yes. I think there's a question mark over how much worse, actually. I mean, it's one of those, it is an impossible question, because the kind of other hypothetical doesn't see the same media profile. So it's hard to disentangle the media profile that having Farage there gives the party versus Farage himself as the leader. It's really difficult to disentangle those. But I think in the circumstances that they were in, where there was so much disenchantment with voters on the right and the Conservatives just losing votes, so many votes, Reform were always going to pick some of that vote up with or without Farage in charge. And exactly the magnitude of that effect, I don't think we will ever have the tools to be able to put a number on that.
Oh, no, sure. I just thought I had to ask. Actually, we've got a question on this sort of structure thing from Sarah Cowley. Hi, Sarah. Saying, is Nigel Farage's level of control over Reform and the lack of internal democracy ultimately going to be a threat to its prospects?
No. I'm doing a lot of one-word answers here, I think.
Doing really well. This is great. We can be done by 20 past.
No, I mean, when for two reasons, really. One, as I mentioned, there are a number of these kind of radical right parties that tend to have quite an autocratic structure to them, and it doesn't seem in any way to hobble their appeal. If anything, it helps them achieve the kind of unity of purpose and of message that boosts their appeal. And secondly, it's a one-man band, but with a very, very high-profile band leader. There really isn't anyone of the profile or appeal of Farage who could possibly fill that space. So the only area where I'd say it might matter at the margins is in terms of boots on the ground and activism and stuff like this. If they're making a serious push in local elections and by-elections, then having motivated troops is important. Maybe they get disgruntled and stay home more. But that's a marginal effect, and set aside the effect of, maximising Farage's broadcast reach, as it were. I reckon it's a relatively small effect. So short answer is it doesn't matter that much if a few Reform foot soldiers are grumpy about this, to be honest.
Okay, interesting. Now, just looking at the political scene now, and we hear lots of arguments about this, who should be more worried about Reform, the Conservatives or Labour? Sophie.
I would say in the immediate future, the Conservatives, I would argue, I think Reform were a massive beneficiary of the drop in Conservative support at the general election. And I think if you look at a lot of the areas that, for example, are up at this round of local elections at the start of May, they're areas where the Conservatives have traditionally been quite dominant, but where there's certainly been rumblings of, I think, Reform support. There was a lot of second place finishes to Tory candidates at the general election. A lot of these areas, they're places where Reform managed to win seats. So Boston, Skegness and Lincolnshire, where there'll be, I think, a mayoral election and a council election. I think there's certainly a lot of opportunities for upsets from the Conservative Party. And it is, at the end of the day, the Conservatives of any party, both in the general election, I think, and since July, where out of them and Labour, who have seen the most of their voters kind of ebb away to Reform over the last few months. So I think the kind of biggest and most immediate threat is to them. I think that's what Farage's mission is, to try and make, I think, Reform a kind of viable alternative to the Conservatives on the right, and kind of replace the Conservatives' purpose for existence kind of in a two-party system. How really realistic that is another question, but that's certainly his intention. And I think with Labour, I think a lot of it is kind of a lot of their fear of reform is based on kind of institutional memory from 2015 onwards. And I think there's certainly parts of the country where kind of the votes that are siphoned off to reform candidates from Labour incumbents are potentially risky to Labour keeping hold of those seats. You know, places in the northeast and the Midlands where Labour's vote didn't go up as much in July as it did in other parts of the country. But I think if you look at those, I think it's 89 seats where a Reform candidate came second to a victorious Labour candidate. All right, they're second, but they're quite a significant distance behind them. And a lot of that came from a very significant drop in Tory support in those seats, which I think, you know, isn't necessarily going to be replicated at another general election. So I think the most immediate and the biggest threat is to the Conservatives if they can't get their act together.
I do wonder as well whether there's a bit of muscle memory from, Barking and Dagenham. So it's not just 2015, but it's, individuals' experience of the fight against the far right that makes them very, very focused. Go on.
I think that's exactly right, and we shouldn't forget that the campaign impresario at Labour, Morgan McSweeney, cut his teeth in Barking and Dagenham. Some of the other people around him, the new Labour General Secretary, Holly Ridley, is another one who cut their teeth in that campaign. But I also think, aside from personal campaigning memories, there's an internal Labour factional narrative, I suspect, around why they keep emphasising the threat from reform, which is that the people that have essentially catapulted Starmer into Downing Street have done so on the basis of a strategy that for several years has been, we need to win voters who are, broadly speaking, socially conservative, Brexity, right on social issues, moderate on economic issues, and they regard anything that enables them to emphasize the need to keep focused on that voter as potentially useful in terms of internal arguments, because their quite entrenched belief is that most everyone in Labour and most everyone who's in the sort of Labour cinematic universe outside is convinced that, really what Labour need to do is unify Remainers and Liberals and have a second referendum and go back into the single market and all these kinds of things. And they think all of that is just nonsense on stilts. And so anything that can be painted as this is the threat we have to be focused on, not your namby-pamby university lecturers who want a soft Liberal party. They will use it in that way. I think what has happened in part is that a lot of that has been taken at rather too much face value externally, and people keep forgetting, as Sophie pointed out, that reform are a strategic headache for Labour, but they are an existential threat for the Conservatives. If you run the current polling numbers with the Conservatives on, say, 21 and Reform on 25 through the MRP abacuses, you have the Conservatives, potentially fitting into the back of a hackney cab. So the nature of the threat, the scale of the threat to the two establishment parties is not the same. Like, it is, reform are a problem for Labour. They're potentially displacing the Conservatives entirely as the main party on the right if the current polling were to hold up.
Okay. Is Nigel Farage Thanos then in this Labour cinematic universe, just out of interest?
Well, purple is his colour, so.
Do you agree with that, Paula? I mean, and also, I suppose the supplementary to that is, are Labour spending so much time worrying about their right that they're not spending enough time worrying about the Lib Dems, the Greens? Because actually the other thing that happened in this election was we saw independents, we saw Greens elected, and surely that should be concerning Labour as well if they train all their fire towards reform and drift rightwards as a result.
So I agree with the analysis that Rob and Sophie have made there about it being a much bigger threat to the Conservatives for lots of reasons that they've already set out. But I think I would just add to that the point at which they could be a threat to Labour is still a really long way off. Could potentially be a serious threat to the Conservatives in 3 months' time at local elections, where the Conservatives have got far more seats to lose. And a resetting of the narrative around who's the best placed party on the right, for example, to take the right forward into that general election can still be set by those local elections. So they're not just a more serious threat to the Conservatives, they're a more immediate threat as well. But the one kind of caveat I would throw into that is Wales in 2026, where Labour have never really been under threat in Wales ever. in the history of the of Welsh devolution, and that, and the kind of threat to incumbents, less popular Labour government in Westminster, rise of reform. There's a perfect storm brewing in Wales. So I don't think they're no threat at all. But the point at which they're a threat to the Westminster government is so far in the future. It seems to me a bit of a waste of energy to be focusing on it too much at this particular point. The point about the threat on the left, I mean, there's not many seats where the Lib Dems are a threat to Labour, so I don't think that's really much of an issue. The Greens potentially could be a threat. Independents obviously are very unpredictable whether or not they can maintain support and so on. But in some ways, a threat from reform helps them with that threat on the left, because it motivates those voters to come back to the Labour Party to counter that threat from reform. Potentially, I mean, there's always the space for Labour to piss them off to such an extent that they wouldn't even dream of coming back. But they are likely to be motivated by wanting to stop that kind of radical right threat in particular constituencies. So I think there's just so many moving parts if we're talking about the general election in 4 years' time, that what I would be thinking about right now is the kind of clear and present dangers of the local elections for the Conservatives and the devolved elections for Labour.
On which specifically, we've got a question from Dan Godley. Hi, Dan, who's just saying, if we want to sort of take the temperature and see how well Reform are doing, which is a better guide, the May local elections or the forthcoming by-election?
I'll have a first go at this. I would say the May locals. Couple of reasons. The first is we get a broader geographical sample with the May locals, whereas one by-election is one very specific context and not necessarily the most kind of pro-reform context either. A second reason is it's a first proper test of reform's organisational capacity in local elections. They didn't really contest local elections seriously in the last parliament, so it is a massive question mark over them whether or not they actually have the kind of resources and numbers and organisation to compete effectively in that kind of context. And again, of course, the yardsticks are going to be the ones we were talking about earlier in terms of 2013, 2014. UKIP had a period where they elected hundreds of councillors. Many of those council groupings disintegrated of their own accord before they even got to re-election. Again, therefore, it's not just whether or not Reform win, it's whether or not the Reform candidates who do win prove to be effective at doing the job. Whereas the by-election will set the Westminster narrative a lot more. And of course, if Reform win, it will kind of generate a sort of fever pitch type reaction amongst both Conservatives and Labour, I imagine. But it probably won't be the most significant thing in either the short or the medium term, because to return to Paula's point, the other reason why the locals and the organisational flex that the locals show is important is because it will give us a hint of whether or not Reform are going to be able to compete on the pitch effectively in Wales and Scotland, two areas where they haven't necessarily been breakthrough ready before.
But I mean, the narrative does matter, doesn't it? Because I mean, just thinking back 4 years to Hartlepool and the locals, Hartlepool set a narrative in the media that was quite hard to shake, even if the local election results weren't as bad for Labour as you would have got the impression of given the coverage of Hartlepool, if you see what I mean. So actually, those narratives do matter, don't they?
Well, yeah, and if you're one of the journalists who's feeling terribly bored with this dull and dreary Starmer government, and you want the sort of rolling soap opera of the Brexit Tory years back, then the Tories getting absolutely smashed into distant third place in the by-election, and then the leadership challenge rumours beginning. We've already seen Robert Jenrick popping up at various unhelpful points with reform-friendly sounding interventions. I mean, it would certainly, particularly if combined with a really bad set of local election results, which may well be coming, it would set the scene for yet another feverish summer of Conservative leadership speculation, which, as I mentioned, some of our friends in the Westminster media would probably be quite happy about.
And a lot, incidentally, I've got a comment here that says, please don't refer to Farage as Nigel. You can call him Thanos from now on. Just for the rest of this lunch hour. But there's also a lot of excited chatter about potential mergers between, I mean, which seems to me just, well, you're shaking your head. Go on.
I'll give a three-word answer to this. No, no, no. It will never happen. I will boil my hat and eat it
Oh, here
if
we
there
go.
is a merger between Reform and I say this fully aware of the risks that come with threatening to eat clothing based on a political outcome. Nigel Farage has been campaigning against the Conservatives since he was in short trousers. The people who want a merger are entirely Conservatives. It is not in his interests. It is not in his inclination. It is not his politics. It won't happen. There won't be a merger. The very best that could possibly happen, and I'm making this caveat to avoid having to eat clothing in future, is some sort of informal electoral pact, like we saw essentially with Labour and the Liberal Democrats last time around. I can see circumstances in which something like that happens, but Farage retains his independent brand. But prior to a general election in which Reform essentially propose a merger, rather like Pac-Man proposing a merger with the food that he's chasing and gobble up the Conservative Party. I cannot see any circumstances in which Reform, who are on the rise, would agree to any sort of subsidiary deal with the Conservatives, who are not going to accept any sort of subsidiary deal either. So it is one of those sort of underpants gnomes arguments. People keep suggesting it because they think it makes sense in theory, but there's no way to connect the dots between these outcomes that makes sense.
I think we might have to stop with underpants gnomes and just give up for the day. But obviously, you know, we're not going to be clipping the caveat. We'll only clip the initial statement. You realise that. So you are now exposed. I mean, we'll come back to this because we've got quite a few questions on the current row in Reform and actually what ideological direction the party takes. Strikes has been quite interesting when it comes to this sort of thing. But just let's talk a little bit about issues. And obviously, the big issue for UKIP was immigration. The big issue for Reform so far has been immigration. That's not enough, is it? And I mean, Sophie, you hinted at this earlier about their need to sort of develop policies. Just where are we in terms of public opinion on immigration, incidentally? If anyone's, I don't know if you've done anything recent on this, Rob. It is a concern that is not as widespread as the coverage of the issue would have us think, isn't it?
You want me to go first on this? I know
yeah, I mean, this is your ballpark. So.
I mean, the short answer is
she least expects it.
Okay. I mean, the short answer is the salience of the issue has gone up quite a lot in the last couple of years. So we are now in a scenario again. We keep talking about 2010 to 15, but again, it's once again the relevant comparator. We're in a world where, you know, a third, 40% of voters say immigration is one of their top issues. But there's a couple of very important differences between then and now. The first is that despite that rise in salience, overall public views about the impact of immigration are still more positive now than they were pre-Brexit. But that's an average of two very polarized groups. There's a very, very negative 30 to 40%, and then there's a larger sort of, you know, indifferent to slightly positive group. And we hear an awful lot from the very, very negative group and not very much from the indifferent to slightly positive group. And that brings us to the second really important political difference between now and 10 years ago, which is that immigration isn't even in the top 5 issues for Labour voters. Whereas it is the top issue for the Conservatives and essentially the only issue for Reform on the salience measure. So whereas the Labour governments of Tony Blair and Gordon Brown really had to focus a lot on immigration because it was a clear and present threat to their electoral coalition, the threat is rather different now. It is not a top tier issue for their voters, like en masse, like the 34% of people who voted Labour in 2024. But for those marginal voters that Morgan McSweeney is so concerned about, the hero voters, these socially conservative Leave voters, it is more of a concern. So that's why they tack in that direction. But their overall electoral coalition, I mean, I've said it a number of times, and I think it's worth saying again because it keeps getting forgotten in the sort of sound and fury of today. The current government is the first government that has ever been elected in Britain where the majority of the people who voted for it are pro-immigration. That's never happened before, because before the last 10 years or so, the British public was instinctively anti-immigration year in, year out, election in, election out. That has changed.
Okay, that is interesting.
Can I just throw something else into that, just because I happened to be looking at it before we started, and that is these issues can really change with events as well. And YouGov put out a new data point in their issue tracker this morning. I think it was, might have been late last night. I saw it this morning, showing how defence and security have really risen up the issues. And looking at it, kind of very quickly looking at it before we came on, it looked to me like that had risen up, particularly amongst Conservative voters. So there is a potential move there that might reorder the issues and therefore push them in different directions, because at that particular moment they've got different priorities.
Yeah, actually, I thought in the context of the German election, given those attacks that we saw in the run-up to the election, that if AFT were then sort of topping out at 20%, despite the fact that the news was solely about their issue, that tells us something quite interesting about them. Now, just another one from Sarah Cowley here, which while we're talking about immigration, and it's partly about British politics, but partly there are lessons from other countries as well. If other countries go big on immigration, doesn't that just help reform? I mean, in the sense that Labour trying to sound tough on immigration to try and get wavering potential reform voters, wouldn't they just go for the real thing rather than... So in other words, does accommodation work?
Well, I mean, you mentioned Germany. There's an interesting data point from Germany on exactly this question, because in Germany you had two radical left parties running this time on the left flank of the German governing coalition, which was sort of broadly centre-left. One of which was very socially liberal on immigration attitudes, and one of which, the Sarah Wagenknecht group, was infamously supposedly trying to hit that left authoritarian sweet spot. You know, very populist left on economic issues, very socially conservative on other issues, particularly immigration. And so we have a test of, well, you know, which approach works if you're on the left and worried about immigration. Well, the radical left, Die Linke, had their best electoral performance in, I think, 15 years, with a big surge in the final weeks of the campaign amongst, in particular, young women, whereas the BSW tanked and didn't even make it into Parliament because, it seems, a lot of the voters who otherwise liked what they had to say preferred the AFD. You can't out AFD the AFD. You can't out Farage. Farage would potentially be the lesson from that. And, you know, we do have a similar situation in Britain because, as I mentioned, our centre-left electorate is indifferent to moderately pro-immigration. They're not particularly interested in hearing anti-immigration rhetoric. And the electorate that is simply does not trust any party in general, actually, apart from Reform, but particularly doesn't trust the Labour Party on this. So when you think about messaging as a zero-sum game, if you're talking about X, you're not talking about Y, Z, A, B, and so on. It's really not clear that any upside from talking about immigration offsets the downside of the fact that you are therefore logically and inevitably not talking about a bunch of other issues where you've got a better shot.
Interesting. Now, on left authoritarianism, I mean, you touched on this, Sophie, so I want to come back to you on this about the other kinds of issues where reform might try to make some progress. And before we come on to the sort of socio-economic stuff, because I'm absolutely fascinated by the fact that a lot of these continental parties talk a lot about social housing, a lot about a very left-wing platform, which Reform don't. But the first thing I want to start with is net zero, because Reform clearly hope to make some progress by stressing the impact and the cost of net zero. Are there any signs that that might work that you can detect?
I think the way to think about it is kind of similar to immigration, in that if you're putting out a platform that is very anti-net zero, the people who feel that way are probably already voting for you, or probably already have, most of them. You know, that's not really a position that any other party, you know, the Conservatives tried to do it, I think, but I think if that's your perspective, you were probably the type of voter who was already leaning towards Reform anyway, you know, necessarily. And I think actually if the party's mission, which it kind of seems to be under Nigel Farage, is to broaden its appeal and reach out to the kind of broader kind of spectrum of the electorate. Maybe your average kind of voter who's quite discontent with mainstream politics, fed up, maybe didn't turn out to vote in the most recent election. I mean, I don't think that's a section of the electorate that is particularly bothered about net zero, and where it does have opinions on climate and the environment, they're probably kind of broadly in favour of taking some sort of action. So I don't think having an incredibly strong net zero message necessarily pulls in voters that weren't already going to probably lean towards voting for you anyway. In the same way that I think, you know, if you're really bothered about migration and you probably have quite a kind of skeptical or negative view of migration, you were probably voting for reform anyway as well. It's kind of a similar dynamic, I think.
Yeah, and I suppose we haven't yet reached that point where people face specific costs. I mean, again, with the German example, you'd had the decision on domestic boilers, you'd had the ending of the subsidy on agricultural diesel. So net zero had hit people's pockets, or looked like it was about to hit people's pockets in a very, very specific way. And I suppose we don't seem to be quite there yet here, and I suppose that debate could change. But on the broader economic thing, why don't they just shift left on the economics? I mean, isn't that, I mean, from what psephologists say, that's just an absolute no-brainer, that, you know, that's where the voters are. And why do they seem so reluctant, do you think?
I mean, I think first of all, I don't think it's in Nigel Farage's nature to be left-wing on economics, particularly. I don't think that's his personal perspective. And if we're taking the view that this is a very kind of personality-driven party, then I think that is an important kind of piece of resistance towards that. I think also the kind of really interesting thing about the makeup of Reform's voter base is that you do have this kind of portion of voters who are genuinely, I think, quite socially conservative, you know, quite economically conservative, do take these quite right-wing perspective on things like welfare and economic redistribution. But you also then have a kind of quite significant chunk of the Reform electorate that is this kind of more broadly discontented voters, voted for an array of different parties in the past. As quite a pro, you know, redistribution. These are voters that maybe voted Conservative in 2019 after being Labour voters for a long time, so are quite kind of pro redistribution. They like that levelling up narrative that the Tories ran with in that election. And it's quite hard, I think, for Reform to maybe decide which voter base they're going to appeal to. I think partly because the kind of broader electorate is more kind of the latter, that more pro kind of left-wing redistribution economics. But I think the people involved in the institutional kind of machinery of the party are maybe on the other side of that argument. And so I think maybe trying to balance the demands of those two things is kind of, you know, the second barrier to just being quite upfront about taking a left-wing economic position.
There's another issue as well, which enables Reform to avoid this. Ultimately, when we're talking about left or right in economics, we're talking about how parties propose to make the sums add up, whether or not they want to raise taxes on wealthier people in order to pay for more government services, or whether or not they want to hand tax cuts to people and cut back on services. And Reform don't end up having a very consistent ideological position on this quite often, because they just reject the premise of making the sums add up. So they just say you can have tax cuts for everyone and nothing that people like needs to be cut. It's a very traditional sort of populist position to take, which they can get away with because their policy positions in this area aren't scrutinised to the extent that, for example, Labour and the Conservatives are. So one reason that they can appear right-wing on economics is because their membership, their senior figures like Farage are often, you know, small state tax cutters and stuff like this. But try and find what it is they propose to cut that people like. You won't find anything. And so in terms of what they propose to spend, they look quite left-wing. And one of the interesting questions about Reform, say, leading in the polls, being in the 20s on the polls, is at some point you would think that they're going to face more sustained scrutiny about this kind of very Boris Johnson-esque cakeism on tax and spend, and which way will they jump when they are pressed to actually take a position? Who are you going to hurt? Who are you going to disappoint? Because that's often what these left and right questions are about. Who's going to pay? Who faces the pain?
Yeah. I mean, it did strike me, Paula, that, you know, just thinking back to the red bus and the referendum, that was quite a left-wing economic message, wasn't it? Which was going to get money, we're going to pour it into public services, We're going to help the people who, weren't getting access to those services. And it just strikes me as slightly odd that the success of that campaign hasn't stuck with them a little bit. And I mean, do you think they might go in that direction during the course of this parliament?
But the difference about the money on the bus was that it wasn't coming from taxation.
It wasn't our money. Yeah. Well, it was our money. Yeah.
So there wasn't that trade-off to make there. So it wasn't actually a left-right issue in that sense. It was magic money that was coming free on the bus, and we could just spend it on whatever we wanted. I do think though that some of this comes from them being a little bit too influenced by the US right, rather than, as you already said, the kind of radical right in Europe, which does tend to be a bit more left-leaning. The instincts are much more in tune with the right, the right-wing US, how the Republicans have moved, which is, and the US population, of course, tend to be a bit more small state. They don't have the kind of national religion of the NHS, for example, that we have. Reform voters will back nationalisation of all sorts of things, water, trains, they back that kind of thing, but at the same time want to cut the welfare bill. So it's not as simple as left and right. It's quite messy in places, but I think that the instincts are drawing so much on that right-wing Republican movement rather than seeing what can be done when you put together a slightly different sort of package, as in France, for example.
Okay, well, you've mentioned the US, so let's go there now, because obviously we can't do a single event without mentioning Donald Trump.
No, I didn't.
No, you didn't, but I can't. You've just given me my segue. So, I mean, obviously, in some cases, like Canada, Trump's had a massive impact on domestic politics in other countries. You see, I mean, the polls have been mad there. But what implications? I mean, can we sort of tease out any potential implications that a Trump government might have for Farage? I mean, Farage is seen as a friend of or an acquaintance of the president, at least. Is that playing out at all in any polling now? And how do we think that might, the fact of Trump might impact? It's an awful question because we don't know what Trump's going to do. I just want you to speculate wildly.
Okay, I'll have a go with that important caveat that we don't even know what Trump's going to do this evening, let alone what he'll do for the next few years. But there's a couple of things we do know. We do know that Trump is tremendously unpopular in Britain across the political spectrum. Even amongst Reform's existing electorate, there is at best ambivalence towards the US president, including quite a substantial chunk of those voters who don't like him already. And based on his first-term performance, those numbers could fall further. Secondly, the kind of stuff that Trump does in terms of assertive nationalism, power plays, often publicly humiliating people on the global stage, as we've seen with the Canadian example, we're seeing also recently with the Polish example. This is not the kind of thing that assertive nationalists domestically are very keen on. Oh, you're mates with a US president who has humiliated our country. That's not necessarily going to go down. So we know that kind of behavior is risky for the kind of voters that Reform are interested in. And the third thing we know is that Farage is closely associated with Trump, does not deny those associations, cannot deny those associations. So if Trump does become a problem, it will be a difficult problem for Farage to run away from. On that final point, though, I would remind everybody of one thing, which is that thanks to our 5-year electoral calendar, there is a pretty good chance that Trump, assuming that he doesn't overturn the constitutional order altogether, will be out of office by the time the election comes around. And people fade out of the limelight pretty quickly once they're out of office. Who's talking about Biden and his potential effects on British politics now? Well, we would be at that sort of point if we're moving into the election campaign of 2029. So it may be that even if Trump becomes a liability, it's a liability that Farage will still have time to shake off before we get to our own general election.
Interesting. There was a really interesting piece by Peter Kellner, I don't know if you read his Substack, which pointed out the fact that under the US Constitution, he's perfectly able to run. So he can run in the next election and he can win the next election. He's just not constitutionally able to serve, which might provide a really interesting situation at the next US election. But we're already getting a sense of how this thing can make reform uncomfortable over Ukraine, aren't we? A little bit, in the sense that, you know, British public opinion is, I mean, by any comparison, not just the US, but other European countries, we're pretty full scale behind Ukraine and behind the need to help Ukraine. Does that cause an issue for Farage and reform?
Yeah, I think it really does. And the polling from the last couple of weeks says, although reform voters were a little bit more pro-Trump to start off with, since the kind of events around Ukraine and that broadcast from the White House, we've seen even reform supporters, their support for Trump has been kind of falling quite rapidly. So I think it can have quite a big influence. And I think there might be space to rebuild a brand, but at the same time, if a brand gets too badly trashed between now and the 6 months before the election, as we have seen with other brands in the past, it might be quite difficult for Farage to build that back. One thing I thought was interesting in this context was, if you go back and look at the polling just before Boris Johnson resigns in 2022, my timeline's gone out of my head all of a sudden, and just before the election, the only issue he or the Conservatives had net positive figures on was Ukraine and defence. It was the only thing that the only thing they've been doing that people on across the whole population were actually still supportive of. So I think there is that sense of real support in the UK for Ukraine and for the actions that Boris Johnson took in terms of supporting Ukraine, and the Conservatives took. And if Reform and Farage look to be undermining that, I think that's a real danger for them in terms of the brand of the party and his own personal brand.
I mean, let's just chuck a hypothetical on the hypothetical, even in the event that it costs money in terms of tax. I mean, we were talking earlier about sort of net zero, and when it comes to actually costing people money, whether that will change things. I mean, in the event that we're talking about defence spending north of 3% of GDP, then presumably there are some tax rises in the offerings. Do we have any sense about, does anything in the way of polling that suggests whether people are willing to make sacrifice? I know those things are very misleading, but I wonder whether that might change the equation slightly. Okay, that was a crap.
It might, but I don't think we would see it in the polling right now. I think this is one of those areas where polling is not going to be very helpful because of the psychology of the question you're asking people versus the psychology of the question they face. The psychology of the question right now is essentially, do you agree supporting Ukraine is really important? And do you want to express very strongly your solidarity with Ukraine? And people will say, yes, yes, very much so, yes. When it hits them in the wallet personally, it may well feel different and they may well react differently. So I think if it becomes an issue, and I think there are plausible states of the world where it does become an issue, or at least becomes more polarized than it is now, it won't necessarily be something that the parties can see coming in the polling. They'll have to try and tease that out in other ways, although I'm not really sure how. I mean, this is one of the things that I think drives everyone in politics a bit loopy, is you cannot get any kind of reliable sense of how people will react to being hit in the wallet from what they say ahead of time. You have to, in a sense, leap and hope sometimes.
Yeah. Okay. All right. I've tried to do this by theme, but actually there are questions building up. So I'm just going to pick a few of these questions and chuck them at you. And if there's a silence for more than a second, I'll name someone to answer it. So the first one is, the current rift in reform seems to be between pro and anti Yaxley Lennon. In the event of a split, are Conservative, you know, if it splits along those lines, does that push Farage closer to the Conservatives, despite what you were saying about him having fought them? That's from Naomi Smith, Best for Britain.
No, I don't think Farage will move, and I think any faction that attempts to be the kind of Yaxley Lennon, the Tommy Robinson reform, well, you know, we've seen that movie before. We know how it ends. That was UKIP and the BNP, and the BNP leader ended up telling people on YouTube how to stew badgers in the event of the apocalypse. Whether Rupert Lowe has badger stewing recipes, I don't know. But I think the prospects, and you know, to use another example from a different part of the political spectrum, Labour and Change UK. Everyone was like, well, oh, you've got some MPs, but what's the point of you? You're like a less good version of the thing that we already have and like. No, thank you. That's exactly what any slightly more far right version of reform offers. Everything that they have reservations about with regards to reform, but not the things they like about reform. So I think such an effort is basically doomed, and I don't see any reason why reform would actually move their positioning in response to it.
Sophie, this is one for you. I hope. Are increasing numbers of young people backing reform now? Is there evidence that they're becoming more? Because again, looking at the West European example, high levels of support for some of these radical right parties from young people. It's not been quite the same here, but was any shift in the general election or subsequently?
I think to say that massive numbers of young people are backing reform is an exaggeration. I think certainly there are more people voted for reform than have voted for UKIP or Brexit Party where they were able to in the past in comparison. But I mean, it's still, it's still more young people are still more likely to vote for the Labour Party or some other kind of party of the centre left than they are for reform. And there's actually, there's a gender split in there as well, which I think is quite similar to the German example of I think we saw around the general election, there was a lot of discussion about young men and their propensity to vote for reform. And it certainly was the case that we saw, I want to say about 16%, but I can't quite remember off the top of my head of, I think young men 18 to 24 voted for reform, which, it's a sizable chunk of that electorate. I think it's still a relatively small portion of young men overall, considering men who don't turn out to vote in elections as it is. We were seeing almost equal numbers of young women voting for the Greens as well, and it's still being slightly more likely to vote for centre-left parties, but particularly for the Greens and parties of the left. So I don't think the discussion is necessarily young people becoming way more open to reform, or even necessarily young men becoming kind of exceedingly open to voting for reform or for the far right. Certainly they are them more than they have before. I think actually the question is, why are young people becoming so polarised along gender lines and looking to parties on the right and the left as opposed to the centre? I think it's a bit kind of misleading sometimes to just look at reform and not, how it works, how it is working in both directions, actually.
I would add to that we might want to ask ourselves why it is that when young men are going over to one radical option and young women are going over to another radical option, we hear 10 to 100 times as much about the young men going over to one radical option than we ever seem to hear about the young women who are also making new and interesting political choices. But for some reason, that never seems to be a lead news item. So there does seem to be a gender skew here, but it isn't necessarily just in the way people are behaving in the polling booth. It's in how that behaviour is being covered and talked about.
Yeah. And you're absolutely right, Sophie, about Germany, because of course you had a significant proportion of young women voting for Die Linke this time round, which actually was remarked upon quite a lot in the German press, to be fair to them. And actually, I'm going to ask you this one as well, Sophie, because you're young and you might understand the question, which is, to what extent is the popularity of these populist parties down to their ability to use social media like TikTok more effectively than other parties?
I'm always a bit skeptical of the idea that just because a party can make TikToks that young people vote for them in droves. I mean, I think very few people are looking up political content on TikTok. I mean, I'm a massive politics nerd who does this for a job, and it's very rare that I'm ever watching party political stuff on my For You page on TikTok. So, I mean, I think it's certainly an element in drawing people's attention. I'm sure there was an element of young people seeing videos of Nigel Farage on the social media feed and thinking it might be kind of, I don't want to say a funny thing to vote for reform, but like a novelty for a kind of subsection of younger voters. But I mean, I think actually when we were talking about that kind of gender split, then when I did a little bit of kind of a cursory research into that a few months ago, actually young women who were voting for parties of the left and young men who were voting for reform parties on the right were actually expressing just a lot of discontent about their lives and about their position in society and about their kind of pessimism about their futures. And all right, they were channeling in different directions, but it was kind of that sentiment of apathy that was actually driving those vote choices, I think, far more than social media feeds and the content they were seeing online. So I think the question is more not what should kind of parties be doing to appeal to young people, and should they be kind of increasing their uptake of social media, but actually why is it that young people are seeking kind of parties on the far right and far left to kind of solve that feeling of discontent that they've got, and not to parties for the mainstream.
Interesting. Thank you. How damaging do you, any of you, think that the current Farage-Lowe spat is for the party? Paula, keen?
Oh, well, I don't know about keen. I don't think it's particularly damaging at the moment, because I don't think that many voters that aren't on social media are paying any attention to it whatsoever. Probably large numbers of them don't even know it's happened. But the potential to do something more long term, not in terms of it causing a rift, causing new party, notwithstanding Rob's comments about that new party is probably ultimately going to lose. For a while, it's going to take some of the oxygen. It will take some of the support, albeit a smallish chunk. So I think there's a potential there for it to be damaging in the longer term, depending on how that plays out. Should that party that splinters off suddenly find itself with a very rich benefactor behind it, for example, it might change the dynamic of a campaign. But in terms of how it's going to affect Reform's polling right now, I think Trump and Ukraine are a far bigger threat than the internal spat.
And Sophie, I want to give you this one, which is obviously one of the things. I mean, Rob mentioned this before, that actually we don't talk. We talk a lot more about these radical right parties than we do about left wing. I mean, are there lessons that either the Lib Dems or the Greens can learn from Reform about how to increase profile, or is it simply down to the fact Reform happened to have a charismatic leader who is, as Rob says, probably the second best known politician in the country, and there's really nothing you can do about it?
I think that's certainly an element of it. I mean, if you look at kind of the recognition ratings of Farage compared to a Davey, or I'm even struggling to remember Adrian Ramsey. I'm pretty sure that is right, isn't it?
Yeah.
And Carlton, yeah, which says something if even I'm struggling to remember the names, then, you know, that is a massive disparity. And I'm sure that does feed into it in an era where kind of party leaders are these really massive central figures in driving voter attraction. But I just think also, you know, the last year or two, particularly the last general election, circumstances have been much kinder to Reform than they have been for the Greens or necessarily the Lib Dems, in terms of kind of driving voters towards them and the impact that they've been able to have. You know, the Liberal Democrats did very well from the collapse in the Tory vote, but they didn't necessarily attract much from, you know, discontented Labour voters. The Greens did a little bit, but, you know, nowhere on the scale. So I think, you know, it's partly a mix of kind of circumstance and party recognition, but I think also just the part of the country where Reform vote is concentrated, or kind of latent vote can be concentrated, and how that's attracted is maybe just a bit more kind of helpful to Reform, and it's a bit more difficult for the Greens and the Lib Dems. They often find themselves in electoral contests where the vote is a bit more fragmented and there's similar parties competing for the same vote. So I think it's kind of a mix of all those things.
So you don't think more bungee jumping and jet skiing is the way ahead, though?
Well, can I just add, you could reframe your question completely.
Could.
Rather than the Lib Dems and the Greens learning from Reform, surely what Reform need to do is learn from the Lib Dems and turn their vote share into a huge number of seats.
Yeah, but
so
I mean,
maybe bungee jumping is the answer.
no, that's fair enough. But I mean, specifically in terms of coverage, it does seem to me that Reform generate a disproportionate amount of media coverage. Would you think that was fair?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think that, I mean, that was my experience back with the UKIP as well. And it's an interesting kind of chicken and the egg question, which is, you know, does this media coverage help to boost the profile and appeal of these parties, or is it a reaction to the rising profile and appeal of these parties? I think that question is a bit easier to answer now than it was 10 years ago, because Farage is an established part of our political furniture now, and he does just make waves because he's such a big figure. And we did see that Reform got much less coverage when it was Richard Tice's party than Farage's. But I do think, I mean, I noticed the disparity, particularly when we have elections elsewhere in Europe. Much of the coverage of those elections here, both in its volume and its sort of focus, is very much driven by how the radical right has done, and focuses very strongly on that issue, which I think does paint a somewhat distorted picture of a fragmented political landscape. And I'm not entirely sure why that is. If it's just because these parties are seen as, in some sense, more disruptive or more threatening or more interesting, that they tell us something. I mean, it's the bleeds it leads thing, I guess, is probably the most plausible hypothesis, because a lot of people in politics worry about the impact of these parties on political systems and so on. They are the story because they are the threat, quote unquote. No one is worrying about Carla Denyer turning our country into a sort of semi-democracy. They might worry about that with radical right parties. It'd certainly be right to worry about that with the AfD. So maybe it's just simply that bad news always does lead, and this is seen as the story that's the most disruptive, therefore the most kind of bad news.
Brilliant. We have now run out of time. We've timed this perfectly. So I'm afraid we can't put any more questions to you. Thank you, all three of you, so much. We'll have you all back on soon because there's going to be loads of politics. We've got local elections and whatever. But for the moment, thank you all. Thank you all for tuning in. For those of you watching, if you're interested, on the 27th of March at 1, we've got our next lunch hour, which is going to be which is our economics panel. So Jill Rutter, Jonathan Porter, Ben Chu, and Sarah Hall